Hey everybody, it's Boo-Ray Perry from Tampa, Florida. I'm a professional photographer and I am a user of the Fuji X100V. In fact, my entire video channel here on YouTube is pretty much dedicated to this camera. So if you just got this camera, and it doesn't even matter if you got the V, maybe you got the F or the T or the S or the original Fuji X100. If you got any of those cameras, then this is the video you want to start with because I'm going to take you step by step through some of the features in this camera that you need to know about. Some of the things that make this camera special and make this the life-changing, beloved camera that it is. All right, let's get started. The first thing we have to talk about is the cult of the Fuji X100V. Now, you probably didn't know this when you bought the camera, but you have now joined a cult. There are rules. One of them is that you have to wear the official cult hat at all times when you're using the Fuji X100 series of cameras. Number two is that you have to talk about this camera like it's the greatest camera you've ever owned in your life. And the reason you have to talk about it that way is because it is the greatest camera you've ever used in your life. This camera is just fantastic. You have to respect the camera. You have to learn about the camera. You have to give a special wave to anyone who you see using the camera, like a how's it going? Fuji X100 series, you know, like the way that people who own Jeeps will wave at each other when they pass. You're a member of the cult now. You're one of us. You don't have to give us any of your income, but you do have to respect the camera and respect your fellow members and be nice to each other because this camera's got a lot of little tricks to it, a lot of things it can do that other cameras can't do, and a lot of people have questions. So learn about your camera and then help other people because, man, it's just a fabulous camera. First off, one of the things that makes this camera so unique is the lens. This camera has what's called a fixed prime lens, and that's different than the lenses that you will see on other professional cameras and even on some of the hobbyist cameras. First of all, it's fixed, which means you can't take the lens off. Most of the time when you buy a professional camera or even a serious hobbyist camera, you can take the lens off, right? You can put a different size lens on there. You can't take this lens off. And there's a good reason why you can't take this lens off. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes because there's things you can do with this camera you can't do with other cameras, specifically because you can't take the lens off. And the other thing is, it's a fixed prime lens. Prime means you can't zoom. So not only can you not change the lens, you also can't zoom in and out. However, that's a little bit of a workaround when it comes to the zooming issue. First of all, they do make these add-ons. They make two of them. One of them is a wide-angle lens, and this is the wide-angle version. And the other one zooms the lens just a little bit. It's not a huge zoom, and it's not a huge change to the width either if you get the add-on that makes it wider. But it does make a difference, and it is optical, meaning that it is the glass. It's the looking through the glass that changes the way the picture looks. So this actually just goes right on the front of the camera. On my channel, you will find a video where I talk about this and I review it and I show you the different pictures I've taken with it. And if you're thinking about getting one, it's a great video to watch so you can learn more about this lens. The camera also has a digital zoom. A digital zoom is like the zoom you see on your camera. You know, you pinch zoom. You're not actually zooming optically when you do that. What does that mean? An optical zoom means that the lens itself, the glass inside the lens, it changes. You know, frequently the lens will move in and out, right? And this very technical sounding thing I'm doing here, but the way that these glass pieces inside the lens, you know, coordinate with each other will create a zoom effect. You know, like a pair of binoculars will zoom, or a telescope will zoom, or a zoom lens on a camera will zoom. That's an optical zoom. A digital zoom is like a pinch zoom on your camera. And what a digital zoom does is it really just crops the image. So if you take a picture and then later you crop in tighter like this, right? And you crop it so now it's, you know, you've cropped away the edges and it just gets this big. You haven't actually zoomed in optically. All you did was crop away the edges. And now when you look at it full size, it looks like you've zoomed in, but you didn't zoom in. It's the same size as it was before. You just cropped away the edges and got closer to it now. That's all. So it's not the same quality as an optical zoom. However, the digital zoom in this camera is fantastic, and Fuji has software in here that will upscale the image. So even though you cut away the edges of your picture with the digital zoom, it then takes the picture and upscales it to make it the same size as if you didn't cut away the edges. I have a video all about this where I decided to test it. I want to find out, does the digital zoom make your picture look better than if you just take it afterwards and like crop it in Photoshop or some program? And I was very surprised at the results, so be sure and check out that video. I also want to point out that I'm going to have links to all the videos in the description for this one, so you can see all the videos about this camera that will help you have a great time using this camera. Another thing you can do with this camera that you can't do with, well, you can do it with a lot of cell phones now, I guess, but I think a lot of people don't take advantage of it, is that you can shoot in RAW. So if you don't know anything about RAW versus JPEG, a JPEG is a standard image that you take with a phone or with a camera. It's a JPEG file. All the images you upload online, they're usually JPEG files. Unless you're using an Apple phone, which now uses a file called a HEIF, H-E-I-F, a HEIF file, which is like a JPEG. So the difference between a JPEG and a RAW file is, imagine you're going to make a cake, right? So you make a cake and it comes out of the oven and it's done. And then you're like, there's not enough salt in this cake. Well, what are you going to do? Well, you can put some salt on top of the cake, right? Well, that's kind of what you're doing with a JPEG. You have a JPEG that comes out of your phone or it comes out of your camera, and then you decide, oh, it's not bright enough. So you're going to try and make it brighter. But you are really just painting on the surface, right? You're making it brighter on the surface. You're not really making the image brighter. You're just like adding a coating on top of your picture to try and make it appear brighter, like putting salt on top of your cake. Now imagine if you instead could make a cake where you put all the ingredients in a bowl and you mix them together, and then before it goes in the oven, you can actually taste it. You can taste it and see exactly what it's going to taste like after it comes out of the oven. And then you can say, oh, you know what? This needs more salt. And you can put salt right into the mix, right? Right there in the mix before it actually gets baked in the oven. That's what a RAW does for you. You shoot in RAW, you actually, when you look at a RAW image on your computer, you're actually looking at the raw ingredients of the image, and it's showing you what the image is going to look like when you bake it, when you turn it into a JPEG. But right now, you still have access to the ingredients. So if you go in and decide you want to make it brighter or darker or change anything else, you're changing the ingredients. You're not painting over on the picture. And this makes a big change in the way your pictures look in the final result. And you can make much bigger changes that way than you can. If you've ever taken a JPEG and you tried to make it much brighter, it doesn't look right, right? The whole thing looks washed out, it looks weird. With a RAW, if you make it much brighter, it's as if you actually shot it that way. So RAW is a big deal. So if you're going to this camera from having used your phone and you've never shot in RAW, RAW is a big deal. Now, the downside is you have to actually, it's one more step that you have to go through before you can actually use your pictures, because you have to convert from a RAW to a JPEG. And that's, the other downside is you have to have a program that will convert it. I think that Fuji probably has a free program that will do that for you, but most people, they use Photoshop RAW, they use Lightroom, they use Capture One. There's a couple of other programs you can probably get for free that might do it. And so it's one extra step. But if you really want to get serious about your photography, most serious photographers shoot in RAW. Now, I'm a serious photographer. I do this for a living. And with this camera, I shoot in JPEG most of the time. Now, I just talked about how great RAW is and how you can make all these changes after the fact. But here's one of the things that makes this camera so life-changing. This camera does such a good job of capturing the image the way you want it to be, and then converting that image to JPEG right inside the camera instead of doing it in some software after the fact, that most of the time I discovered that when I was shooting in RAW, that I wouldn't make any changes to the image. It would be right out of the camera in RAW. I'm like, yeah, that's good. Just turn that into a JPEG. And so I finally got to the point where I was like, you know what? I'm just going to skip the step, because I want to take lots of pictures and have fun and take it on vacation and shoot with my family. And I don't want to have to work with all these RAWs. So you know what? JPEG. I just shoot in JPEG. Now, here's the cool thing. You can shoot in both. You can say shoot in RAW and JPEG. So sometimes I'll do that. So it shoots in RAW and JPEG. It gives you two files. And then when you get home, you look at them all, and you're like, oh, the JPEGs look good? Great. You can just delete the RAWs. But if there's a couple of JPEGs, you're like, oh, wait, that one's not quite. Well, then you can go to the RAW file. You can change it and make that the JPEG. So it's got that bonus. Most all professional, semi-professional cameras work this way. This camera isn't special because it shoots in RAW and it shoots in JPEG, but I wanted to talk about it because I think that there are a lot of people probably who are buying this camera because it's exploded on TikTok lately, and Fuji is saying they're not even going to take orders for it because they can't fulfill the orders fast enough. I think a lot of people who are going to be going to this camera are people who have never shot in RAW, and it's daunting and scary for them, and it can be. But here's the great thing about this camera. You don't have to shoot in RAW, and the pictures will look fabulous. So don't feel like you've got to go down the RAW road with this camera. You can just shoot in JPEG, and you're going to be very happy with what you get. Okay, the other thing you have to talk about if you're going to talk about any Fuji camera is the film simulations, because Fuji is the only company that does this. And it makes this camera very cool, especially if you're shooting for social media, because we've all gotten used to on Instagram, where you apply filters, and most people who put a lot of pictures online probably have Snapseed or Canva or something in their phone that they use to adjust and change their files before they actually put them online. Well, the film simulations that are built into this camera are very, very cool. And what makes them so great is that they actually mimic true, real film. Fuji is the only camera manufacturer that actually is a film manufacturer. They actually make film, and they have for many, many, many years. So their understanding of color science and their understanding of how to make things look a certain way is a little bit deeper than the other folks out there who do it, because they have experience with film, and that's where it all started. So the simulations in here are fantastic. There's so many of them, and they're always adding new ones. I'll tell you, my favorite from your simulation is called Classic Chrome, and I have a video about that on my channel where I explain in detail why Classic Chrome is the best simulation. And again, it's totally subjective. It's my personal favorite. High neg is also really cool. I like high neg a lot. So check out Classic Chrome, check out high neg, try these different simulations. Now, you can shoot in RAW, but the simulation won't be applied until afterwards. And then I think it's only going to be applied if you're using a program that is able to do that. So like I use Capture One, and Capture One applies the actual film simulation into it. You can actually change the film simulation right there in Capture One. So you can shoot in ProNeg and then decide you want it to be Classic Chrome and then change it before you turn the file into a JPEG, which is a very cool thing. But I'm telling you, for most people, just shoot in JPEG and apply the film simulation that you like, and knock it out. Rock and roll and have a good time. All right, now we're going to talk about some of the things that truly make this camera unique, besides the fact that it's the most beautiful camera that you can buy. And let me tell you, if you have this camera now, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. You probably didn't notice it before, but when you see ads and stuff and there's a camera in the ads, it'll be this camera because it's just so beautiful. So one of the things that makes this lens so unique, I talked earlier in the video, I talked about how it's a fixed prime lens and how that can be limiting, but it also gives you some advantages that you don't get in other cameras. And chief among those is the fact that this camera has a leaf shutter. I'm going to start right off the bat by telling you that I have a video about the leaf shutter. I have a couple of videos really that kind of talk about the leaf shutter on my channel. The leaf shutter is a game changer with this camera. You really need to read and learn about the leaf shutter so you understand what you can do with this camera that you can't do with other cameras. But the bottom line is, the short form is, you can take pictures in bright sunlight with this camera that will look different than the pictures that are taken in bright sunlight with other cameras because of the leaf shutter, right? There's a limitation to what you can do in bright sunlight, and especially when it comes to what's called depth of field. And the depth of field is what's in focus. So when you take a picture and everything behind the person is blurry, that's called a shallow depth of field. It means only a little bit is in focus. So like your depth of field is measured, like if this is your depth of field, it means that if you focus on someone's nose, then that's it. That's all that's going to be in focus is the nose and this far, okay? It actually is on either side. So it'd be the nose like this. That's what's in focus. And if you have a deep depth of field, it means everything's in focus, and your phones shoot with a very deep depth of field. And that's why we have portrait modes in the phone, where the phone actually goes in after the fact and makes the background blurry to make it look like it has a shallow depth of field, but it's not quite right. It's not quite accurate because it's not optical, it's digital. Well, with this camera, it has a fixed lens that shoots at f2, which is a very wide opening, which gives you a very shallow depth of field. And you'll find that you want to shoot with a shallow depth of field most all the time because that's the really cool look that you have. But if you're in really bright sunlight, you can't necessarily do that because by shooting with a shallow depth of field, you have a really big opening, which means a ton of light is coming into the camera, and it's so bright that your picture is going to be overexposed and it's going to be too bright. But with a leaf shutter, you can do some things that you can't do with a normal camera to actually get that light to come down, so you can get a shallow depth of field even in bright sunlight. Be sure and watch my videos about the leaf shutter. I'll put links down in the description. The other thing the leaf shutter does for you is it allows you to do some things with your flash that you can't do with any other camera. The little tiny flash that's built into this camera is effectively much brighter than the little tiny flash that's built into any other camera that you buy, and certainly much brighter than the one that's built into your phone. It enables you to do things in bright sunlight once again. Like if you're shooting someone in bright sunlight, but they're in shadow, a lot of times, another camera like this with a small flash, you can't get the flash to be bright enough. But with this camera, you can. Does the flash get brighter? No, it doesn't. But the leaf shutter makes it so that you can raise your shutter speed much higher. And by raising your shutter speed, you will make everything darker, so the flash appears to be brighter. Now, this is very technical, I know, but that's why there's a whole video about this. So go watch the video about using the flash in bright sunlight and the leaf shutter videos, and you will really understand one of the things that makes this camera so beloved, because professional photographers love this camera. And the reason we love this camera is that it has a gear that the other cars don't have. I don't have, in all my professional gear, none of them have a leaf shutter, because you can't have a leaf shutter in a camera where you take the lens off. But you have it here. So it really, really does some very cool stuff. I say that, maybe you could have a leaf shutter in a camera where you take the lens off, but they don't. They just don't make them. I don't know enough about that to be able to say for sure. So don't, before you call me out in the comments, maybe you can, but they just don't make them. So the leaf shutter is very, very cool, and you absolutely need to learn about the leaf shutter. Another thing that this camera has that other cameras don't have is a built-in neutral density filter. A neutral density filter, it sounds fancy and sophisticated, but it's actually very simple. All it is a pair of sunglasses for your camera. It's just a lens that goes in front of your camera that's dark, and it cuts down the amount of light that comes into your camera. And this is something that you use on very bright days, because if you want to shoot with a really shallow depth of field, I talked about this already, and you want to have the hole really wide and open in your camera, so much light is coming in, you need to cut it down. So what do? You engage the neutral density filter, which cuts that light down while allowing you to keep the big opening and get the shallow depth of field. Other cameras don't have this. If you want to do this with another camera, you have to buy a neutral density filter and you have to screw it on the front of the camera. This one's built in. It's a four-stop neutral density filter in the Fuji X100V and a 3-stop neutral density filter in the Fuji X100F and the ones before that have it. And by the way, if you don't know what a stop is, that's okay. Don't worry. A stop of light is a measurement that photographers use for measuring how much light comes into the camera. One stop is twice as much light or half as much light, depending on which way you're going. So if you let in a stop more of light, you've now just doubled the amount of light that's coming into the camera. If you let in a stop less, you have cut the light coming into the camera in half. That's a stop. So what makes it tricky is that it's additive. So if you were to increase your exposure by 2 stops, you'd be letting in 4 times as much light. Yeah, because the first stop lets in twice as much light. And the second stop lets in twice as much light as you have there. So it's twice as much light, and then you double it again, and it becomes 4 times as much light. And if you let in another stop, it would be 8 times as much light. So you see how that works? So when people talk about a stop, this stop, that stop, the F stop on a camera, that's what they're talking about. So that's if you don't know that, that's cool. Don't feel bad, believe me. But understanding what a stop is one of those things that's nice to know, because you'll hear photographers talk about it. And if you watch videos and stuff about this camera, you'll see that a lot of people who own this camera are professional photographers. So they'll throw lingo. They'll talk about stops and fixed and prime lenses and stuff like that. And so it's nice to understand that a prime lens is a lens that can't zoom. And a fixed lens is a lens that is stuck to the camera and can't come off. And a stop is either twice as much light or half as much light, depending on which direction you're going. The last thing we have to talk about is the viewfinder on this camera. The viewfinder on this camera is niche. Yeah, to say the least, it's niche. It's cool, but no one really uses it. You know, it's a cool little nostalgia thing. It's like, have you got one of those cars where if you want to, you can shift it into manual mode and you can manual shift the car? Yeah, that's cool, right? Do you ever actually do it? No, because it's like, well, this is just too much trouble. I mean, the car does it for me better than I can do it anyway. So you hardly ever really do it. Well, that's the way the viewfinder on this camera works, because the viewfinder has two modes, OVF and EVF. OVF stands for optical viewfinder, and EVF stands for electronic viewfinder. Electronic viewfinder is the viewfinder that you have on every camera. It's the viewfinder that you have on your phone. When you look into your camera, you're actually looking at a little video screen inside your camera that's showing you exactly what the picture is going to look like. So you can change the settings on your camera and watch the picture change until the picture gets to where you want it to be, and you can take the picture. That's an electronic viewfinder. And this is something that's relatively new. Up until, I don't know, 10 years ago, professional cameras were all what's called DSLRs. And DSLRs, digital single lens reflex cameras, you were looking through the lens when you looked in your camera. You were looking through the lens, but you couldn't see what the picture was going to look like until after you took it. But with mirrorless cameras, you can actually see in real time exactly what your picture is going to look like before you pull the shutter. And that's huge, right? Now we've got the optical viewfinder, which is built into the Fuji if you want to use it. And what that does is it takes away that little thing where you can actually see the picture before you take it, so that now when you look through the camera, you're actually looking right through this spot right here. Now what's cool is, unlike the old cameras, and by the way, this is called a rangefinder camera. Unlike the old rangefinder cameras, even though you're just looking through the glass, it still manages to project onto your view there all the settings, so you can see what your settings are in your camera, and that's very, very cool. You can see where your focus point is. So that's very, very neat. So you get a little mixture of both worlds, where, you know, it's just like, it's old school, except it's got this Star Trek, you know, overlay that it puts on it for you, and that's very, very cool. And the other thing about the optical viewfinder is it widens your field of view. So when you're looking through the optical viewfinder and you've got an optical viewfinder mode, you're actually seeing a little bit more than your final picture. And there's a little bracket inside there that shows you this is your actual picture, but you're actually seeing out here. You're seeing a bigger shot. And this can be handy on street photography, because you can see someone an instant before they actually get into your picture. You can see them and you can plan for that. But the downside is huge, because the downside is you don't ever get to see your picture before you take it. You hope that you got it set right. You have to look at the settings. You have to look and see that your exposure is right by looking at the dials and the settings and the graphs inside of your camera. And listen, I'm a professional photographer, and so I spent my whole career doing that. But once I switched to mirrorless, I didn't do it so much, because now I just look at the picture and look does it look right? If it looks right, then I shoot it. And that's what you do, right? You've been using a camera in your phone your whole life, and that's what you're used to. So why would you go back to suddenly having to manually shift? It's cool. Yeah, it's a neat little thing they've added, but I don't know anybody that really uses it on a regular basis. And if you do, talk about it in the comments, because I'm not trying to say it's stupid. I'm just saying I don't know many people who ever really use it. Now, I will say this, something I've been meaning to do, which would be fun, is, you know, if you're kind of a photography nerd, then you're like, what if I went on vacation or whatever, and I treated it like it was 1965, right? What if I turned off the screen on the back of my camera and I used only the optical viewfinder, and I never, ever looked at the pictures? You could do that. You could go on vacation with this camera, or you could go to a party, And you could just shoot using the optical viewfinder, which means you're not seeing the picture before you take it, really. You're not seeing the picture on the back of your camera. And if you don't ever hit that playback, you're not reviewing it on location. And you could shoot the whole night or the whole day and then not actually look at your pictures until you get home and decide to upload them to your computer and look at them, or look at them on your camera. But it would be interesting to go old school and not be constantly checking what you're doing. Oh, that's not good enough. Let me try that again. But, instead just be like, oh, click, click, click. I don't know what I'm getting. I won't know until I get home. Right? That's the way it worked for years. So you can do that with this camera, which would be kind of cool and kind of fun. Like I keep meaning to do it as a project, and when I do it, I'll make a video about it, where I'll just like spend a day shooting just with the OVF, and then we'll look at the pictures together, right? I'll do it one of these days, but it's really hard to give up that crutch of being able to see the picture before you actually take it. Well, all right, that's it. That's my beginner's guide to the Fuji X100V. And again, not a lot of detail about each one of these things, because each one of the things I talk about deserves its own video and has its own video on my channel. So go into the description and check out the video. But I did want to just say these are the things you want to pay attention to if you just bought these cameras also. Oh, and you know what else you want to pay attention to? I have a podcast, and it's called Photobomb. It's available anywhere that podcasts are found, so you should be sure and check it out. It's very entertaining. You'll have a good time with that. And I have a group on Facebook. It's called Pro Photo Talk with Boo-Ray Perry, and it's not a place to go and post your pictures. It's a place to go and talk to other photographers and have questions and have a community, and a lot of great people in there. So I encourage you to join that. I think you'll definitely have a good time there. And also on my gear page, if you go on my links, I have a link to my gear page. And on my gear page, I have everything that I own, both my professional equipment and my Fuji X100V equipment. So all of the accessories that I have for this camera, like this thing, this is invaluable. This thumb grip, I love this thing. I have where did I get all the stuff that I use for my camera? It's all on my gear page. So go check out all that stuff on my gear page. And if you click one of those links to Amazon and you buy something, I get a couple of dollars, and it helps me to keep this channel alive. And I really appreciate it if you help me out. So that's it. All right. Questions, comments down in the comments, please. And be sure and click like, and be sure and click subscribe. And welcome to the cult.